Independence Day.
Thank you for joining us for the Safety Center's June webinar entitled Rural Multimodal Planning. I'm going to take a few seconds and go through our polls, and then we'll move us over to our webinar. It does look like we have about 48% of you joining us from the Western U.S., about 14% from the Midwest, 18% from the Southeast, about 4% from the Northeast, and we have around 14% of you joining us from elsewhere as well. Most of you, as always, about 84% are joining us by yourself, but we do have a few of you joining us in a room with several different people. Again, I will provide you with a little bit of information in the next set of slides about how to make sure we know who is joining you so that we can ensure you can receive CEUs and certificates of completion if you do choose to do so. It looks like we have about 22% of you joining us from state DOTs, about 9% from local transportation departments, about 6% from tribes, 3% from public land agencies, and about 15% from other federal, state, or local government agencies today. We also have about 35% of you from private consultants and about 8% from other. And then it does also look like we have most of you joining us by computer only today. Just a reminder for everyone, if for some reason the audio does cut out on you, you may feel free to call in on your phone line as well. Sometimes we have better results with that. The 800 number can be found in the top left-hand corner of your screen. You may also use the chat pod at any time to let us know about technical difficulties that you may be having, and our WTI staff member will attempt to assist you while we carry on with the webinar. So as we get started here, just a few webinar logistics for you. The duration of today's webinar will be an hour and a half. As always, we are recording today's webinar so that it will be archived on our website. You can expect that to show up on our website within the week. For quality of the recording, we have muted everybody during the presentation. You may feel free to put questions into the chat pod on the left-hand side at any time. You don't have to wait until we stop at a question and answer period. Our presenter will attempt to answer those as they come in. However, if there are any remaining in the chat pod when we hit a question and answer period, I will ask those one at a time to him as well. And again, you may feel free to put those in at any time and don't have to wait. If you are listening on your phone, we would ask that you please mute your computer, otherwise you may hear some feedback. I also do want to point out in the top right-hand corner, there are 4 arrows that press outward. If you click on that, it will make your PowerPoint in the center full screen and get rid of all the rest of the extraneous information along the outside of your screen. This may help for any graphics or figures we may be showing today. At the end of each section, as I mentioned, there will be time for question and answer. There will be 2 periods which will take question and answers. We will also be using poll questions at those times to test and make sure you've learned today's learning objectives. In the bottom left-hand corner, you will also find a handout pod. We have put a PDF version of today's slides in case you would like to download that for your notes, and we will also be posting that on our website along with the archived version of this webinar as well. We will have 2 surveys that come out following today's webinar, as always. The first one will be sent directly following today's webinar. The link is now showing up on your screen as well, because sometimes this does end up in junk mail, so you are able to copy that right now if you would like to. The survey for today will be about the content in today's webinar, and it will also allow you to answer those learning objectives poll questions again, as well as sign up to get CEUs and certificates of completion for today's webinar. That is the only way we can do that. The survey will close 2 weeks after the webinar, and you can expect certificates and CEU forms around 3 to 4 weeks after the webinar. We do manually create those and manually email them all out. The CEU forms that are sent to you, if you fill those out, they can be returned to continuinged@montana.edu and not the Safety Center. That is a different part of Montana State that runs that for us. You may also request a verification of completion form from them, and on the screen right now you'll see both the course registration form that needs to be filled out, as well as what that verification of completion form looks like. A verification of completion form will show all of the different webinars and or summits, of which we've had 2, that you've requested CEUs for. And at this point in time, the only one that we have not sent out is our May webinar on motorcycle safety. So if you did request CEUs or certificates for any of our previous 40-plus webinars or our 2 summits and have not received those certificates, please do let us know. You can email us at info@ruralsafetycenter.org. As well, for those of you joining us in a group today, if you can make sure that we do get an email at info@ruralsafetycenter.org with a list of names and email addresses for those of you in the group, so we make sure you do receive the surveys and are able to sign up for those CEUs and certificates. Today we're lucky to have Todd Litman with us. He is the founder and executive director of the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, which is an independent research organization dedicated to developing innovative solutions to transport problems. His work helps expand the range of impacts and options considered in transportation decision-making, improve evaluation methods, and make specialized technical concepts accessible to a larger audience. His research is used worldwide in transport planning and policy analysis, and we are thankful to have him with us today. For the goal of this webinar, once you've completed it today, you will have a knowledge of why and how rural communities and small towns should apply more multimodal planning. And to achieve this goal, you will learn to summarize current demographic and economic trends that are increasing the need for multimodal planning, and then how to identify specific multimodal planning policies and programs. And at this time, I am going to turn the presentation over to Todd for our first section. Todd?
Thank you very much, and greetings to everybody from Victoria, British Columbia. I'm delighted to participate in this program, and I must admit I'm somewhat humbled because I realize that these issues are very diverse, and many of you that are attending this webinar have good experience dealing with some of these issues. So I don't pretend that I am going to provide the single answers or the complete answers to everybody's questions, but I hope that my presentation will give a very useful overview of the range of issues considered in rural and small town multimodal planning, and I'm looking forward to what I hope will be some give and take, where if any of you participants have information to add, you're certainly welcome to bring up your own experience or your knowledge. So let's proceed. So we live in interesting times. If you are a planner, you are a professional problem solver, and that is a wonderful activity to engage in, and we should be proud. But we are facing a number of, you could either call them emerging problems, or I like to call them emerging goals. So a problem is something that you don't want, and a goal is something that you do want to achieve. So for most problems, you can turn it around into a positive statement and say that we can define our goals. So if, for example, traffic accidents are a problem, you would say our goal is increasing safety. So in the transportation planning world, there are a number of existing or older goals, things like increase traffic speeds and reduce congestion delay and increase parking convenience and accidents. And now we're facing a number of emerging goals. So things like increasing affordability and improving disadvantaged people's economic opportunities and creating more attractive and vibrant streets and supporting local economic development. Increasing public safety and health and protecting the environment. All of these are important goals that may not have been given a lot of attention in the past. And so part of the fun of being a planner is that we are always looking for emerging issues and using our creativity to develop good solutions to those problems. In the world of in rural transportation planning, one of the emerging issues is an understanding that we need to be more multimodal. That is, we need to consider walking, bicycling, public transit, ride-sharing taxis in addition to conventional automobile travel. And so rural communities are beginning to think about this, and there are a number of specific issues that, or you could call transportation needs, that drive this increasing concern about multimodal planning. In rural areas, many rural residents experience isolation, or they bear high costs, what you could call inaffordability associated with excessive household transportation costs, aging population, and the desire to age in place means that people who currently drive need to start planning for a future where they are unable to drive. A desire to retain younger residents, an increasing portion of whom don't have a driver's license or don't want to live automobile-dependent lifestyles. Rural areas have high and growing portions of residents with some sort of a disability, high poverty rates, high crash rates, emerging health and environmental concerns. All of those issues are increasing the demands or the need for multimodal planning in rural areas and smaller communities. Or to put it differently, we're developing a greater understanding of the value of multimodalism. So you could say that an efficient and equitable transportation system must be diverse in order to allow travelers to choose the most efficient mode for each trip. And so even if, for example, most people rely on automobile transportation for most trips, that doesn't eliminate the need to serve other forms of travel, the travel needs of non-drivers, and to make use of other modes. So let me go through some of the current demographic and economic trends that are increasing the need for multimodal transportation planning in rural areas and small towns. So this slide shows the aging trends, the portion of the solid lines show the portion of residents aged 65 or older, and as you'll see, the rural areas, that is the red line, is much higher than the urban populations, that's the blue line, and it's growing. The growth is particularly significant in rural areas. And as this next slide shows, as people age, their ability to drive declines. And we know that. This slide shows that broken down by area and gender. And as you'll see, in rural areas, there is as people grow from 75 to 85 to 85 plus, there is a very dramatic decline in their ability to drive, and particularly for rural women. And so one of the implications is that rural areas are going to need to continue to improve the travel options that are suitable for aging non-drivers. Of course, it's more complicated. Even people who can drive are often, as they age, even older people who can drive are often limited in their ability to drive, for example, at night or in heavy rain or other poor weather conditions, or on busy roads. And so this graph is actually understating the need to accommodate non-drivers in rural areas as populations age. Many seniors want to age in place. That is, they want to continue living in their communities as they grow old. And one of the most significant constraints on aging in place is transportation, is the need for people who are losing their ability to drive to be able to access the services and activities that they want while living in a small town or a rural community. Another important trend is increasing poverty in rural areas. This graph shows the portion, the poverty rates, that is the portion of households that are considered impoverished. And as you'll see, the rates are much higher, significantly higher in rural communities, and particularly poverty rates for rural residents. So rural low-income people are significant and growing. This graph shows the transportation cost burden comparing urban and rural areas. Rural households on average spend 19% more on transportation than urban residents, than urban households, and this is a major cost burden. What we find if you look at, for example, housing foreclosure and bankruptcy rates and financial crises in low-income households, that the transportation or vehicle expenses, say a car breaking down or having an accident, and so you need to replace a vehicle, is often the most severe financial risk that low-income households face. So a more positive way to say this is that improving affordable transportation options in rural areas increases financial resilience for low-income households. That is, it increases a household's ability to manage if they have a financial crisis of some sort, or and in particular, if their car breaks down or for some reason they can't drive, they can continue to meet their needs, things like getting to work or going shopping or accessing medical services or other critical activities. So multimodal planning helps address the financial stresses, and you could say it increases economic resilience. Now, this shows up in many different ways. An interesting survey performed by the U.S. government, the National Household Travel Survey, performed in 2009, had an interesting question. It asked the survey respondents to prioritize or to rank the transportation problems that they face. And a very interesting result was that the transportation problems or the transportation issues that receive the most attention within the transportation planning world did not turn out to be the highest ranking. The highest ranking issue was, they called it the price of travel, or you could say inaffordability. And what was particularly interesting is that this was broken down between urban and rural, and in rural areas that was particularly high. So by far the most significant transportation problem identified by the system users is the very high cost of transportation, the price of travel. So how do we solve that? Well, multimodal planning is an important component of that, offering people feasible, functional, affordable transportation options in rural areas helps address that goal. So here's another, this slide shows a map of the portion of, or the number of the portion of households that are both poor and have a member who has a disability. And you'll see that the rates are particularly high in some rural areas. Again, emphasizing the need to develop transportation services and options that meet the needs of low-income and mobility impaired residents. Now, there's some other emerging issues. Another issue is local economic development. Many rural areas are actually losing population and losing some of their economic drivers, their economic activity as a result. And for some of the reasons that we just described, multimodal transportation planning can help rural areas attract and retain residents and businesses. There are a number of factors here. Think of it one example is that if a rural community fails to accommodate the need for aging in place, you're basically saying that as soon as you are no longer able to drive, we're expecting you to move somewhere else. And there certainly are retirement communities or areas that are where residents can move to and count on having the appropriate services, but that's a loss to their existing communities. And it's a loss not only in terms of they're no longer there participating in community activities, but it's also a loss of economic activity. Think of your pension, your retirement expenses. If you move to a retirement community, you're taking all that spending away from your existing community. To put it more positively, if a community can do a good job of serving the needs of aging populations, they're going to be able to retain that household spending and the businesses, the services and activities that the economic activities that result. So that is just one of many ways that improving multimodal transportation planning can support local economic activity in rural areas. It also helps non-drivers access jobs. It helps consumers reach local shops. It can help attract tourism and the business activity they support. And it helps reduce some of the transportation problems, such as reducing parking costs to developers and businesses. Another good reason to support multimodal planning is to increase traffic safety in your community. Now, there's very good research showing that, unsurprisingly, the more people drive in an area, the higher the per capita traffic fatality rates. As this graph shows, the relationship is particularly strong in rural areas. So as an area becomes as an area becomes more automobile oriented and people drive more annual miles, you can expect traffic accidents, per capita traffic accidents, to increase. And there's a good body of research showing that as a community becomes more multimodal, traffic fatality rates decline. So this graph shows the per capita traffic fatality rates for urban regions, indicating both youth, that is red, and total, that is green, relative or the rates relative to public transit ridership. And one of the conclusions of this is that people who live in more transit-oriented, more multimodal communities have much lower traffic fatality rates. And that's particularly true of youths. And what this suggests is that many high-risk drivers, such as youths, actually want to drive less. They want to reduce their exposure to risk, to accident risks. But they can only do so if there are good travel options. For example, if you live in a very automobile-dependent community, as soon as your son turns 16 or 17, you're tempted to buy him a car because you're tired of chauffeuring him everywhere. And so he becomes a young driver that's a high-risk driver. And but if you live in a more multimodal community, youths will defer their getting a driver's license. Parents are less, there's less pressure on parents to buy young people a car, and they're going to drive less than they would in more automobile-dependent areas. And so that and a similar pattern occurs with seniors or with people with some sort of a disability, or even when people are going out drinking. If you live in a community that has local bars and pubs, you can walk to the store. You can walk to the bar or pub, where if you live in an automobile-dependent area, you're much more likely to drive there and therefore drive home after you've been drinking. So these are examples of ways that multimodal planning can increase safety. By the way, I see in the chat box, there's a question how to get citations for what I'm showing you. And I should have mentioned at the start that this slideshow is based on a report posted on our website, on the Victoria Transport Policy Institute website, called Multimodal Rural Planning. And I'll show at the very end of this slideshow a link to it, or how to access that. So everything that I'm saying is accessible, is fully cited in that report. Okay, another emerging issue and another reason to support multimodal planning, particularly improving walking and bicycling, is increasing public fitness and health. So we know that rural communities have much higher rates of sedentary living and obesity, and that people who live in more walkable and multimodal communities are much more likely to exercise and have lower obesity rates. So this is yet another reason to support multimodal planning. By the way, the link that was just posted is actually not the link to the rural multimodal planning. So I'll put that up right now. Rural multimodal planning. So that the one that I just posted should be the correct link. Okay, so here's one way to think about it. This slide summarizes the types of people who cannot or should not or prefer not to drive, and the prevalence, that is the portion of a typical communities who have those conditions, and the consequences if their need for non-automobile travel is not met. So for example, you can say seniors and people with disabilities and adolescents and stay-at-home parents with single vehicle households, if they lack non-automobile travel options, if there's poor walking and bicycling and public transit options, they'll either lack mobility, so they're stuck at home. They may require chauffeuring, so somebody else has to drive them, or they might be forced to move to, or they might decide to move to a community that has better travel options. And low-income households will often spend more than what they can afford on transportation. And drivers who temporarily lack a vehicle will be burdened and lack mobility or require chauffeuring or costly taxis. And tourists and visitors to a community will be constrained, or some will simply not visit a community that lacks non-automobile travel options. And a law-abiding drinker will have few options, and people who want to walk and their dogs are worse off if you live in an area that fails to provide active transportation, that is good walking and bicycling options. So these are all, you could say these are demands or needs that should be considered in our transportation planning and justify more emphasis on multimodal planning. So, as we've already seen, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat pod that's on your screen. I appreciate any comments or questions. So this
Todd,
is
we're gonna pause for 1 second because we're gonna do the poll breaks for the audience as well. Okay.
Very good.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to move us over to the poll break, and we have 2 questions for you guys in the audience. The first one is, why is multimodal planning needed in rural areas? Rural aging population is increasing. Rural poverty rates are higher than urban counterparts. Rural households spend 19% more of their household budget on transportation. There is a high percentage, 20 to 40% of non-drivers. All of the above, none of the above, or I don't know, or I don't remember. And the second question is, what do rural residents consider the most significant transportation problem? Traffic congestion, crashes, price of travel affordability, aggressive distracted drivers, I don't know, or I don't remember. I'll give you guys just a few seconds to go ahead and fill those out. And again, if anyone does have any questions for Todd, you can put those over in the chat pod on the left-hand side, and he'll still answer those for you as well. Okay, at this point, it looks like everybody has finished with their results, so I'm going to broadcast these for you, Todd, and if you would go ahead and address the questions, please.
Yes, well, I'm delighted to see what a smart group we have. The vast majority of respondents recognize that there are many reasons to support multimodal planning. And so the best or a good answer is all the above. Although certainly, it's legitimate to say that if you are interested in one of these particular issues, it would be legitimate to rank or to emphasize one of them. And it is interesting that similarly with the question of what are the transportation issues most important to rural areas, as one of the slides indicated, the National Household Travel Survey did show that rural residents put the price of travel, or you could say inaffordability, as rated it the most important issue. Although, again, I would say that it's perfectly legitimate to say that something like crashes are also, for many people, that they would, or for some people, they might say that that's the most important issue. So I think those are all very good responses.
Perfect, thank you. And it does not look like we got any additional questions, so I'm going to move you back over to the webinar. All right, you're all set to keep going.
Very good. Okay, so now we get into how to plan for rural multimodalism, or how to apply multimodal planning to rural areas. And there's a whole set of strategies. It is not just one activity or one intervention, one planning activity. And I want to emphasize this because sometimes when people hear about multimodal planning, they jump to a particular solution, such as public transportation, or improving walking, or improving bicycling, or complete streets, or something like that. But in fact, it really should involve all of them, because they essentially, all of the strategies that I'm going to talk about work together. You could think of it as to get around without a car, you need a menu of options so that you can serve various types of trips. So even people who use public transit will almost always, or virtually every public transit trip has some walking links and sometimes bicycling links. And even people who rely primarily on walking and bicycling will probably need some other travel options, whether it's taxi or public transportation for a few of their trips. Very briefly, improving mobility options, that is improving walking and cycling conditions, and therefore traffic speed control, so making the streets safer for walking and bicycling. Complete streets roadway design, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that. Public transit within and between communities, and various types of ride sharing, ride hailing, and taxi services are all important in rural areas. In addition, there's some community design features. We want to, the community can support and celebrate walking and bicycling and public transit, and concentrate development into walkable towns and villages, and preserve local schools and services and parks in those towns and villages, and ensure that there's affordable housing in the walkable towns and villages, and reduce parking requirements in compact multimodal areas. All of those help contribute to a more multimodal community. In fact, the classic small town is really a great model for a multimodal lifestyle. That is the classic small town of, say, between 1,000 and 10,000 residents that has a main street in the center, often with a central plaza or park, and surrounded by stores and public buildings such as City Hall and maybe your schools, and then sidewalks on all the streets. That is a terrific place to live a car-light or a car-free lifestyle. most residents of a small town like that can live without a car, can get by without owning a car. And so most communities that were built before 1950, that is before automobile-oriented planning became common, really are very good models of multimodalism. Now, so how do you get that? Well, there are a number of planning reforms that are needed to create that multimodal transportation system. So the starting point is to recognize the important and unique roles that walking, bicycling, and public transit play in an efficient and equitable transportation system. And as a planner, you need good information on those activities. Many travel surveys, they overlook or undercount walking and bicycling activities. And they may fail to explore the latent demand. That is, ask people, would they use public transportation if it was available, or would they use ride-sharing services? And so part of good multimodal planning is to collect good information on the demands, the needs, and the activities. Another component of multimodal planning is to shift from focusing on mobility, that is the movement of people and goods, to accessibility, which means people and businesses' ability to get to access the services and activities that they need, which expands the range of solutions that you can apply to a problem. Let me give you an example. If you use a mobility-oriented perspective, you would say that the best way to help low-income households is to subsidize their cars and their fuel so that everybody can even low-income people can afford to drive. But an accessibility-based analysis also recognizes that for many low-income households, the best solution is to make sure that they can live, that they can afford to find suitable housing in a walkable neighborhood, say close to the center of their town, so they don't need to drive as much, that they could get by either with less driving or without a car altogether. So an accessibility based planning recognizes that land use patterns or land use accessibility is as important as mobility. And this is very important for multimodal planning. And accessibility-based planning or multimodal planning also recognizes the importance of the connections between travel options. So for example, the ease of being able to walk or bike to a bus stop or a bus station or a train station is very important for multimodal planning. So let's talk about a few of these travel options. A very important one is active transportation, that is walking and bicycling. There are many ways to improve active transportation in rural areas. Of course, we want good sidewalks and crosswalks, and we want good bike lanes and paths, and we need to make sure that streets are designed so they're safe for pedestrians and cyclists, and that often involves traffic speed management and traffic calming, that is specific roadway designs to limit maximum speeds. And in rural areas, walking and bicycling safety often relies on a safe shoulder. For it's not necessarily a special facility, but it's making sure that your shoulder is wide enough and smooth enough that people can walk and bike. There's also an important component of school transport management. So a good test of whether a community is multimodal is the portion of students, of young people, who are able to get to their schools without being driven. Can they walk or bike or use public transit to get to school? And a component of that is to make sure that as much as possible we preserve the local schools and parks so people, especially young people, can access those by walking and bicycling. There's a lot of research showing latent demand for active transportation. That is, many residents would like to rely more on walking and bicycling, but can't because their communities fail to serve that. There's a really interesting series of case studies that the Federal Highway Administration implemented a few years ago, the Non-Motorized Transportation Pilot Program, which spent about $100 per capita on pedestrian and bicycle programs in 4 typical communities. $100 per capita over a 4-year period. And what they found is community-wide walking increased 22% and bicycling increased about 50% during that time period. And most of that increase consisted of utilitarian travel. So many people, including children, but also including adults, would like to rely more on walking and bicycling, but they can't until their communities invest what turns out to be a relatively modest amount of money, about $25 a year per capita, compared with the thousands of dollars a year per capita that households are spending on automobiles and governments are spending on roads and businesses have to spend on parking. This slide shows one of the solutions that's very appropriate in rural areas. A few years ago, the Oregon Department of Transportation established rural road shoulder standards that identified the size of the shoulder, the road shoulder needed on roadways with different levels of traffic. And this can provide, this is an example of a standard that rural communities can adopt that would improve walking and bicycling conditions without it's not necessarily called a bicycle pedestrian improvement. There are many benefits to having wide shoulders, including traffic safety, and it helps preserve it protects the deterioration of the roadway itself. But it provides very significant benefits to walking and bicycling. Another approach that I think is very useful and important for transportation planners is called complete streets policies. And that means that whenever we design a street or a road, we make sure as much as possible it accommodates diverse modes and uses. So we no longer assume that the only purpose of a road or a street is to accommodate automobile travel. We also recognize that it needs to accommodate walking and bicycling, and in some cases, particularly where it's adjacent to businesses, things like sitting and cafes and other activities that often occur adjacent to a street, but are often overlooked in conventional highway planning. And this is important in rural areas because in many rural villages and small towns, a major highway or busy arterial becomes essentially the main street. So what was initially planned as simply a highway now needs to accommodate more activities and more user types. So there's been a lot of thinking about this, and in my report, Rural Multimodal Planning, there are links to quite a few studies and guidebooks on how to implement complete streets, including in rural main streets where a highway needs to be redesigned to accommodate more local activities. Now, another approach, another component of multimodal planning is improving public transit, ensuring that there is some sort of public transit service both within rural communities and between communities. There's been a number of studies that have looked at the value to rural communities of providing high quality or improving public transit service. Now currently, most rural communities or a rural community that has public transit is typically spending only $20 to $40 annual per capita. And this is much lower than the national average overall, and it's much lower than what it costs to own and operate infrequently used automobile, and it's often less expensive than what a household would spend to chauffeur non-drivers or to take taxis, and to some degree these investments in public transportation can be justified as traffic safety strategies. And so for those reasons, we can say that we can identify the optimal investments in public transportation based on these multiple benefits, or comparing it with the cost of other forms of transportation. Now there are many types of rural public transportation. So each community needs to, or each area needs to determine which type of public transportation will serve best, and that can range from subsidized taxi services or volunteer drivers who chauffeur non-drivers, or community buses and demand response or van pools, and then you get to fixed route transit services and interregional transit services, which are often some sort of a coach highway bus service. So when we talk about public transportation, it's important that anybody involved in planning understands the full range of public transportation options out there and their advantages and disadvantages. This slide shows the areas, include the areas in the U.S. that have some sort of intercity bus services. And this is an area that I think needs a lot of rural communities are struggling with. The commercial bus services are declining. So Greyhound and other private services are pulling back, are not profitable in many rural areas. And so many rural communities are losing their bus service. And as I'll show in some subsequent slides, some future slides, there are some good examples of states and local communities that have found ways to preserve and expand rural bus services. Another component of multimodal rural planning is to apply smart growth, or sometimes it's called new urbanism, or multimodal community planning principles, and which typically involves preserving open space, that is farmlands and habitat, and concentrating developments into towns and villages. And that has many benefits. It preserves our farmlands and habitat, but it also helps create that critical mass that's needed to create a community where you can have walking, and you can have schools and shops and other services and activities within walking distance of most homes. A traditional small town has that concentrated development. It usually has, on the main street, you'll often find housing, that is apartment buildings over the stores, and other types of housing, other housing types that allow that concentration that supports that walkable neighborhood. And of course, smart growth includes more multimodal transportation planning. So let me just mention a couple examples. One good example is, well, there are many programs to apply smart growth planning in rural areas. And in our report, Rural Multimodal Planning, you will find citations of many of these reports and guidance documents. And an example is Sioux Falls, which adopted a comprehensive plan that discouraged sprawl and encouraged more compact infill, and set some what they called community sustainability goals, which included things like encouraging creating more walkable and transit-friendly rural towns. A component of this is to make sure that you have affordable housing in those walkable neighborhoods, which, as I mentioned before, that often means that in a small town, the downtown, the main street, has shops with housing above it. That's a good traditional way of providing affordable compact housing, or allowing more townhouses and low-rise apartments, and support strategies such as reducing parking requirements for that type of housing. So it's easier to build more compact infill development. A term for this that many planners use now is called the missing middle. So when people talk about increasing density and creating more compact neighborhoods, some people mistakenly assume that we're talking about high rises. But in fact, what it usually involves is incremental increases in density. So for example, allowing single-family houses to have secondary suites, or allowing townhouses and low-rise apartments in neighborhoods that currently ban them. And so the missing middle is often allowing the missing middle is often the key strategy to allow affordable infill development and create those kind of walkable urban neighborhoods where households can get by with car-light or car-free lifestyles. So let me finish up with just a few examples of some of the research or planning methods that are being used to support rural multimodal planning. So one very nice study was done in North Dakota where researchers created an index, a mobility needs index for each county that analyzed factors like aging population and poverty and some of the economic trends, and were able to identify which communities are going to have the greatest increase in demand or need for public transportation. And so that could be a useful tool to be able to communicate to policymakers and the general public the growing need to apply more multimodal planning, and particularly to find ways to fund public transit service even in rural areas that traditionally have not had it. Another example is the great state of Washington. The Washington Department of Transportation has long had a program to support interregional, intercity bus transportation. And so the small towns and even cities scattered in the rural areas can apply for funding, state funding, to support, to preserve and improve the bus service, the commercial intercity bus service that connects their community with other communities. This is very important if we want, for example, to allow people to live car-free lifestyles and also to attract tourism. I can report from personal experience that it is very important if I'm traveling to another community to know that I can get there. If I'm going to visit a community, I need to know if I can get there without a car. And so the availability of public transportation to the community, inner city public transportation, is a key factor in determining whether tourists like me can visit a community. There are a number of very good guides. Many of them are quite recent, that provide guidance for multimodal transportation planning in small towns and rural areas. Again, cited in the report. Let me describe a recent example that I'm involved in. This happens to be a highway in our community in near Victoria, British Columbia, where the highway is called the Malahat, and it's about a 20-mile stretch of rural highway that winds through some parks and some hills. And because it's a narrow, hilly stretch of road, there are often requests to improve it, to reduce congestion and increase safety. And the various proposals have costs, various solutions that have been proposed have cost between about $500 million and what is now, taking into account inflation, about $2 billion. So the provincial government is considering spending up to $2 billion to improve this Malahat highway. A multimodal solution, an alternative approach, an alternative to widening the highway, to spending billions of dollars to widen the highway, would be to simply offer hourly bus service, hourly or better bus service over the highway with various transportation demand management incentives, so incentives to encourage people who are currently driving over that highway to use the bus when possible. And using some rough estimates, we estimate that it would cost somewhere between, say, $3 and $6 million of subsidy, a fraction of the cost of expanding the highway to provide basic hourly service over that highway and maintain affordable fares, and would have, for many travelers, it would be a much better solution because, for example, somebody who either cannot drive or doesn't enjoy driving on that curvy and narrow highway would benefit from having frequent bus service, and it would also reduce traffic congestion and parking problems upstream and downstream, where simply expanding the highway is likely to exacerbate downstream congestion and parking problems. And it would also provide significant potential savings, financial savings to many households. So the question is, do these multimodal solutions receive the consideration that they deserve, considering their costs and benefits compared with conventional highway solutions? And in my experience, they don't. That the conventional regional transportation agency or Department of Transportation planning, state or provincial planning, is much more willing, has much more money to spend on highway improvements, highway expansion, than it's willing to spend on public transportation. And so part of our challenge for multimodal planning is simply to create a more balanced analysis that takes into account multimodal solutions and the full benefits, applies comprehensive analysis. Wrapping up, one of the key factors for multimodal planning is to develop more multimodal performance indicators. Conventional transportation planning tends to evaluate transportation system performance primarily based on the ease of driving. So we use a roadway level of service, which is simply an indication of the ease of driving and the absence of traffic congestion. In recent years, transportation agencies have developed more multimodal level of service indicators that also give consideration to walking and bicycling and public transit. So one of the key components of multimodal planning is to develop more multimodal performance indicators. It's important that performance indicators reflect all aspects of the planning process. So one way to think of it is you can evaluate the inputs, that is, what are the resources that we're spending on walking and bicycling and public transit, and how does that compare with the resources spent on automobile transportation. And then you can ask, what are the outputs, that is, if we invest in walking and bicycling and public transit, what will be the mode share of those what portion of trips will be made by those modes? And for example, if we improve walking and bicycling, will you see more walking and bicycling activity? And then, but we're ultimately interested in the outcomes, that is the results, things like are non-drivers able to take more trips? Are they able to access more services and activities? And are households able to save money because they live in a walkable and bikeable and transit-friendly area? And how do people access critical activities and services? How are they able to get to schools and jobs and healthcare? And do you see positive outcomes such as reductions in obesity or diabetes? And so our multimodal performance evaluation should be designed to account for inputs, outputs, and outcomes. Now, I realize that multimodal planning is in many communities, especially rural communities, it's a new concept. And so a key role that planners play is to build broad support, to show people, including many people who have a car and rely on automobile transportation and may not think of themselves as beneficiaries of walking and bicycling and public transit improvements, to show them why even they should support more multimodal planning. And so there are various themes that advocates or planners can use, starting with a discussion of these demographic and economic trends and discussion of the demand, including the latent demand for these modes, and identify how improving travel options, improving walking and bicycling and public transit can help achieve regional development goals or regional planning goals or development objectives. Things like affordability and savings to governments and supporting local economic development, improving health and quality of life. And in particular, I think it's important to emphasize the benefits to non-users, that even if you don't use public transportation, you may benefit if it reduces your traffic or parking congestion, if it reduces your chance of being the victim of another driver's errors, in particular that it can reduce the high-risk driving by youths or people with impairments. Another component of building broad support is to frame it in terms of business case. What are the economic returns, including things like reduced parking costs to businesses, consumer savings, reduced roadway costs, reduced accident costs, and we do need to demonstrate that we are doing good. We are using the public funds responsibly, so fiscal responsibility. And in doing that, I think that especially now we have opportunities to build broad public support for more multimodal planning. So this is a chance. That is the end of my basic presentation, and so this is your chance to present, to share your questions and comments. And we will also have some the quiz questions in just a second.
That's correct. So I'm going to move us over to our other poll break. The chat pod will still show up, so you can continue putting in any questions. Our questions for you as an audience, we have 3 of them this time. The first one is true or false. Rural multimodal planning reforms such as integrating connections between modes and enhancing accessibility enhance transportation efficiency. And then we have complete streets are likely to include, and you can choose all that apply for this one, sidewalks and crosswalks, bike lanes, attractive benches and light standards, on-street parking, flyover intersections, or I don't know, I don't remember. And then our last one for you is smart growth development policies are unsuited to rural communities, yes or no. We'll give everyone just a few seconds to fill those in. And again, if we do have any questions for Todd, if you can put those in on the chat pod on the left-hand side. We do see one coming in now. Okay, Todd, I'm going to go ahead and close out these polls and broadcast the results for you. Looks like that first one's all set. I'll give the other 2 a couple more seconds. Okay, so the results of all 3 polls should be broadcast now if you want to go ahead and address those, Todd.
Okay, well, we sure have a smart group here, and I'm glad to see people were paying attention. So I believe that rural multimodal planning does achieve enhanced transportation efficiency, and I would add transportation efficiency and equity, that it ensures that that everybody gets a fair share of public investments in transportation, including people who don't drive or don't want to drive for every trip. And so efficiency and equity are very important. Second poll, yes, complete streets include many features that make sure that they serve diverse users and uses. I generally don't think that a flyover, that is the type of intersection where cars don't have to stop. Those are usually considered freeway enhancements, not complete streets enhancements. But all the other strategies do. And I do believe that smart growth policies are very suited to rural areas. In particular, they help preserve many of the features that make rural communities rural. They reduce loss of farmland and habitat, and they concentrate, smart growth policies concentrate development into towns and villages, and so they help preserve what we have and provide these benefits, such as people being able to walk and live a car-light or car-free lifestyle. Okay, so I think we can go on. I will now answer Jill Shelley's question. In your experience, what type of state, provincial, or national laws get in the way of implementing multimodal travel in rural communities? So that's a great question, and I would say that a lot of it is not specific, or it's in the funding structures and the way transportation agencies define their goals and evaluate potential improvements. So in most states, there is far more money available to spend on highways. A good portion of your transportation funding is dedicated specifically to highways, and your Department of Transportation or Ministry of Transportation is traditionally oriented toward highway projects, and it is difficult to shift that funding to walking and bicycling and public transit improvements, even if a comprehensive analysis or an objective analysis would conclude that the alternative modes are actually more cost-effective and beneficial than continuing to expand highways. Now, this is not in any way suggesting that we should abandon highways and that every trip should be made by walking and bicycling and public transit. But in many situations, I believe that that multimodal planning is actually more cost-effective and beneficial, but the way our funding and planning practices are structured makes it is far more difficult. That investments in walking and bicycling and public transit often need special new funding, where the funding for highways is already pre-dedicated, and therefore it doesn't require the same level of economic analysis. Another component of this is that at the local level, we often require parking. That most jurisdictions require a generous amount of parking at any destination, and that's just written into the zoning code, and it's a very large subsidy for automobile ownership and use that is itself that is both invisible, so most people don't think of those parking spaces as a subsidy, and it doesn't show up. Those parking subsidies don't usually show up in any accounting, and they contradict efforts to create more compact and multimodal planning. So, for example, I'll just give you a funny, interesting illustration. Of all the types of all the land use types, the one that requires the most amount of parking per square foot or square meter of building space is a bar or a pub. So on one hand, we're promoting, or we're trying to promote, or we're trying to discourage impaired driving. We're saying, don't drink and drive. It's a terrible thing. You should never do it. On the other hand, at the local level, we say anytime you build a bar or a restaurant or a pub where we expect people, we know that many people will be drinking, we say we need to ensure that it's very convenient to get there with your car. And not only does this encourage driving to the bars and pubs and restaurants, but it also makes it very difficult to build a bar or a pub or a restaurant within existing neighborhoods. It makes it much more attractive to build those at the urban fringe where land is cheap and it's easy to build a big parking lot than it is to take, let's say, an old empty storefront on your main street and turn that into a microbrewery or a pizza restaurant. So the minimum parking requirements are another example of a planning and funding mechanism that's very oriented toward automobile travel, that in a more multimodal with a more multimodal planning practices, you would say, let's take some of the resource, some of the money and some of the land that's devoted to parking and make it available for walking and bicycling and public transportation. And also that we would place a higher value on the community design or community development practices that ensure that anybody who wants to live in a walkable neighborhood with at least basic public transit service can find housing in that area. So I'd be interested in hearing any feedback on that. Are there any other questions or comments?
At this time, it does not seem like there are. I am going to continue on with the presentation, but if anyone does have any final questions or comments on Todd's remarks that he just made, you can feel free to put those in the chat pod, and I will check one more time before we do finalize the webinar. So in today's webinar, you have learned to summarize the current demographic and economic trends that are increasing the need for multimodal planning, the why, and also to identify specific multimodal planning policies and programs, or the how. We did want to point out, as Todd said before, that his company, the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, does have a website with a lot of different resources available, and you'll see those listed right now, some of the ones he would like to highlight. So we would recommend that you go check those out. And in the chat pod earlier, he did put the one for the Rural Multimodal Planning document, which is the website you see at the bottom of the screen, along with /RPM. So you can go ahead and check that one out as well. We do want to point out we have a few upcoming webinars that are scheduled for you. The LTAP Center's Safety Peer Exchange will be our next one. That will be held on July 16th from 9 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. Mountain. So please do note that that is at our other time that we do use for trainings. So it's a little bit earlier than this one that we typically use. We will also have one on safe systems for rural areas that will happen July 31st from 11 to 12:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And a third one that we're hoping to host in August on the 22nd from 11 to 12:30 p.m. Mountain on animal vehicle countermeasures. So we would love to see you at all of those. The registration is open for that LTAP one, and on the registration page for the Rural Safety Center, you can find more information about what exactly the 4 presenters will be speaking about at that webinar. We do want to mention one more time that we do have an archived trainings page on our website, which has the streaming links to every one of the webinars that we've hosted. There are over 40 of them, and you are eligible for the CEUs and certificates of completion, even for our archived webinars. Underneath the streaming links, there is also a survey that you can take showing us that you did indeed watch the webinar and request those CEUs and certificates of completion. I do want to also mention that there is the Low Volume Roads Conference coming up September 15th through 18th in Kalispell, Montana. The Safety Center will be hosting a workshop on the Sunday before that starts, as well as doing 2 presentations, one on safety research and one on the Rural ITS Toolkit. So we would love to see all of you there. That web link is available in case you'd like more information about that Low Volume Roads Conference. And Kalispell, Montana is a beautiful place to come in the fall time, so we'd love to see you there. I also want to leave you with Todd's contact information in case you do have any additional questions, as well as how to reach us at the Safety Center. And it looks like we do have some more comments in the chat pod, so I'm going to read those out real quick before we close. John says, to add to your points about perhaps compromising the amount of land or space for parking and giving it to other modes, the DC Department of Transportation says that fewer parking spaces often means fewer cars on the road. There's a direct link between traffic and the availability of parking. Understood that DC is not a rural environment, but their new CTR guidelines are available, and he has provided a link to where people can find those guidelines if you'd like to see what they are doing in the DC area. So again, Todd, I do want to thank you again for presenting today. The information that you've put in your report and that you presented today was very valuable, and multimodal planning is one that we have not yet tackled at the Safety Center. So we do, again, appreciate you taking the time to do a webinar for us on this topic.
Thank you all very much. It has been my pleasure.
Everyone have a great afternoon, and we hope to see you in July for our 2 webinars. Thank you.